Hi everyone, thank you for being here today for this talk that is organized by the CIT. We're very lucky today to have two speakers. One of them I think we know more than the other because he's one of ours. But let me first introduce Dr. Rob Goodman, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration and a member of the Youth School of Graduate Studies at Toronto at TMU. He holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University, as well as an MA in public policy from George Washington University. He was previously an Andrew W. Mallon postdoctoral researcher at Michigan University, a core curriculum instructor, and Heyman Center for the Humanities Fellow at Columbia University. Before beginning his doctoral studies, Dr. Goodman worked as a speechwriter for U.S. House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer and Senator Chris Dodd. Our other speaker is hardly needs an introduction, but I will still read some of his bio for so people don't know him. But Kim Richard Nossal went to school in Melbourne, Beijing, Toronto, and Hong Kong, and attended the University of Toronto, receiving his PhD. He joined the Department of Political Science at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, where he taught international relations and Canadian foreign policy. Before he came to Queen's University in 2001, heading the department until 2009. He was also a director of the CIDP from 2011 to 2013, and from 2013 to 2015, he was the executive director of the Queen's School of Policy Studies. And I will just let Dr. Goodman take it over from here.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us. Thanks, Professor Nossal, for inviting me and for really generously sharing this platform with me. I think it's both good news and bad news that there are an increasing number of people who are concerned about these issues, the future of Canadian democracy and the way that Canada's domestic politics and foreign policy are impacted by the really concerning developments we see in U.S. politics. So it's of course bad news that we have to be concerned about these things. I think it's good news that so many smart people are, and I accept myself from that, obviously, I don't count myself in that category, but I think it's so good that there's so much engagement around these questions. I'm aware that I'm in a room of a lot of experts on Canadian politics and Canadian foreign policy, and I'm also aware that when I talk about these things, I very much do it as an outsider. I do it as someone who, as was mentioned in the introduction, worked in U.S. politics for quite a while, studied in the U.S. I grew up in the U.S., but now makes a home here, is raising a family of 3 kids here and doesn't really imagine going anywhere else. So I very much think about Canada as an adopted home for me. But when I talk about Canadian politics and history and the challenge of Trumpism in the U.S. and what that might mean for us here, I do it from the perspective of someone who's relatively new here. Obviously, there are downsides to this. The downsides are details that I might miss or lack of expertise I bring to the problem. I hope it's compensated for by the upside, having perspectives on these questions that come from outside perspective and that come from some of my experience in U.S. politics. So I hope it's helpful. I just want to talk very briefly to provide some room for Professor Nossal and to have some time for Q&A. And I think there's so many people who have things to share. I think that's the best way to use this time. So let me just say really briefly, I called the book Not Here. In a lot of ways, of course, that's a riff on the kind of the classic Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here, or variations on this, like Will It Happen Here? Or a recent book that came out just called Did It Happen Here? So this is an established kind of theme in worrying about the possibilities of whether we call it authoritarian populism or just authoritarianism or xenophobic populism or right nationalism or Trumpism, or even we might use the F word, fascism, which Joe Biden is kind of wading into recently. Whatever we call this phenomenon, I think it's fair to say it's a real phenomenon. But people have asked me when I make the title of my book around this question of whether it's going to happen here or has it happened here or will it happen here, part of the question is, what do we mean by it? What is the scenario we're afraid of? When I look at this question from the perspective of what it means for Canadian democracy, I'm really concerned about the high amounts of U.S. influence in Canadian politics. And if the far right is gaining and becoming a political force in American politics, if anti-immigrant or xenophobic populism are gaining in American politics, if outwardly and openly authoritarian political messaging and practices are gaining in American politics, what does that mean for us here? Is that going to affect Canadian politics? I can see it affecting Canadian politics in lots of ways. On the one hand, it might provoke backlash. It might provoke Canadians to think about their politics in a lot more, in a way that stresses differences and divergences from the US and stresses the reason why it hasn't happened here and why it won't happen here. That's certainly a good scenario, and I hope that there is a lot of that backlash. I hope there's a lot of focusing on what makes Canada a distinctive society and distinctive political culture. But I also think there's a lot of possibility for what we might call, for lack of a better word, contagion. And I'm kind of wary of that word because I don't like the way the kind of biological metaphors work in politics a lot of the time, because I can kind of makes us think that we don't have agency over our futures and the decisions we make collectively. But whatever word we use to describe this metaphor, I think it's certainly the case that a rising authoritarian movement in the US will have friends and allies in Canada, will have funding sources that travel back and forth across borders, will share a media ecosystem, will share a meme ecosystem, will share political messaging, will share political strength. I think we all know ways in which authoritarian movements up to this point collaborate across borders. Just to, one kind of example to stress this point, I think about how, of all the places that Tucker Carlson could have filmed their show, there's a reason that if he's not filming in the Fox News studio, he's filming in Hungary with Viktor Orban. I think there's a reason for this, and I think it speaks to collaboration across borders. So when I think of what it is and how Canada can avoid it, what I try to talk about in my book is what, at least from my outsider's perspective, makes Canada's political history and political culture distinct. I think that's something worth talking about in Q&A because I don't want to dominate too much time up here. But I guess I'll just say by way of closing, when I tried to think about what it means for it not to happen here, I thought the most important thing that I can contribute is thinking in a systematic way, from an outsider's perspective, about why it hasn't yet happened, why Canadian politics is different, why Canadian political history is different. What are those sources of Canadian distinctiveness that I think right now are democratic safeguards? And I suppose at the end of the day, the reason I think this is a valuable service, to the extent that even writing a book about this can be a valuable service, is I think one of the most powerful things that authoritarian figures like Trump is this element of surprise, this element of shock. I think we've seen the same thing around figures like Milei in Argentina just recently. This idea that always by raising the ante of shock, by always violating a new norm, or by doing what Steve Bannon calls flooding the zone with shit, there's always, I always wonder if I should bleep myself when I say that, but I feel like I'm among friends. The element of shock is a big part, and deliberately so, of authoritarian politics, going all the way back to Mussolini in the 30s, who really theorized about this. So one of the things I think we can do as people who think about history and think about and study politics is try to dispel that element of shock by talking about the roots of contemporary politics in deep American history and the roots of whatever Canadian resilience we might have to this kind of politics in Canadian history. And that's a little bit of what I try to do in the book. Not because I think that my insights are grounded in any kind of special expertise, because as I say, I'm a relative outsider, but because I think one of the valuable things that we can do is to dispel that sense of shock, dispel that sense of outer nowhereness, dispel that sense of one-of-a-kindness or uniqueness or crisis, not because this is not a thing to worry about, not because crises don't happen, but because I think the first thing we can do is get our heads fastened on straight. The first thing we can do is try to approach the threat of an authoritarian America, or an America moving in an authoritarian direction, with a real sense of clarity and having that shock dissipate. And if my book does a little bit of that, and I'm happy to talk about how I try to do that a little bit more in Q&A, if my book does a little bit of that, I feel like it will serve a little bit of a purpose. So thanks you all for listening. I'm really happy to have this discussion with you, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having us, for organizing this. When I read Rob's book in the summer, I had just finished putting Canada Alone to bed. The last time that I was able to write anything in there was in April, and so even now it's a little out of date given what's happened in the United States. But there is, as Rob says, a number of folks in smaller countries who are writing about the Trump challenge. In Australia, Bruce Wolpe, actually an American who was a chief of staff to an Australian prime minister, wrote a book, or has written a book called Trump's Australia, which also looks at the impact on Australian politics. I wish we could have had him here too to do the comparison. And so that having Rob here today to discuss the Trump challenge is a nice reflection of the concerns that have been increasing. And as you know, in the last several weeks, what we've seen is an increasing flood of those concerns as Mr. Trump has widened his lead in the battle for the Republican nomination. And so you've got things like the lead story in The Economist, who declared Mr. Trump the most serious threat that we face in 2024. You get Robert Kagan writing in the Washington Post about the really serious possibility of a dictatorship emerging should Trump win. And we've got to keep in mind, and something that I think underscored Rob's argument, was that there actually is a plausible path to the White House for Mr. Trump. Or if, how should we put this genteelly, should nature intervene in the intervening months, anyone who survives the present Republican Party, a party that has shifted quite considerably so that it is no longer recognizable to those of us who grew up with the sort of the old Republican Party. If there is a Republican candidate, that candidate will have had to move through the MAGA crowd, the MAGA domination, not only at the national level, but also, and far more importantly, at the state level across the United States. And it's that possibility, that plausible path for a Republican candidate, but most likely for Mr. Trump, that really is what we want to talk about today. My book is only partly about that. My book is really about the American world that Canada has learned to love so much since 1948. Although we don't talk about it in those terms or as Canadians, but it is indeed an American-dominated, American-led, a hegemonic America. We are part of the West, and the American-dominated, Western-dominated global order, organized very much in the interests of the West and not at all in the interests of others. And so when we talk about the international order, we always have to keep in mind that we're talking about an order that is constructed very much in our interests. But in the last 10 years, and what the book seeks to do is to look at how that order has been challenged, not only by Russia, the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin, but also under the People's Republic of China, well before Xi Jinping, but particularly after Xi Jinping emerges as paramount leader in 2012, 2013. But there's a third challenge, as we all know, and that challenge comes from within the United States itself, paradoxically. And it is led by Donald Trump and those allies around him. It is very much infused into the contemporary Republican Party. And Rob's mention of Viktor Orban and Hungary underscores the degree to which today's GOP, a party that looks at Vladimir Putin, who looks at Viktor Orban and sees positive elements, basically says it all. what I want to do today is to look at a little bit of what the book does, and that is to look at what the likely consequences of a Republican victory is, and or likely will be. And there are a couple of elements here. One is to absolutely to follow Rob's assessment of the impact and of a MAGA victory in 2024. And that is to recognize that in fact, the cross-border effects will go in two ways. One indeed is a contagion, and I actually don't mind that idea in large measure because when I look at manifestations of MAGA politics here in Canada, I might be forgiven for thinking of it as a contagion in the way that we think of things that are contagious. And certainly we've had a preview of what MAGA politics looks like, and all we have to do is to look at the so-called Freedom Convoy in Ottawa in 2022. When Canadian and a few American protesters very much demonstrated what MAGA politics will look like in Canada. I was telling Rob that there are out of that a number of visuals, but my favorite visual is one where there's a whole bunch of flags, and one is a flag that features Donald Trump, but not Trump in real life. Rather, and you all know the tendency, the buffed Trump, Trump without any shirt on, but with a very buff, non-77-year-old body, and carrying a huge gun, flying next to some Fuck Trudeau flags, flying next to a Gadsden flag, distinctive yellow American flag with the timber rattlesnake and Don't Tread on Me. There was also a Canadianized version of that with a Canada goose rather than a timber rattlesnake, and the slogan "Don't tread on me," eh? That was very much part of it. But the idea, and there was also in that mix of flags a swastika, of course. The flying of these flags tells us a lot about the northward contagion of American politics. This, by the way, is not at all unusual. Canadians, if you think back over the last 50, 60 years, Canadians frequently take Americanized icons of protest and use them as their own. But there also is going to be a southward effect, a southbound effect, because it is likely that if, in fact, Mr. Trump comes to power and the so-called Red Caesar movement, along with Project 2025 and Schedule F, actually makes their appearance, which will lead to the profound transformation of the American state, and all of a sudden, a transformation of American policy. What we're going to see, it seems to me, is precisely what was anticipated in the TV version of The Handmaid's Tale, and that is a protest movement, an opposition movement based in Canada. And that is going to, seems to me, lead to a huge resurgence of anti-Americanism in Canada. Now we've seen anti-Americanism in waves before, and in that sense, that will be nothing new. But anti-Americanism, when you've got an exceedingly thin-skinned administration in Washington, is going to be particularly problematic. And in particular, when you have a president of the United States that has, as Mr. Trump does, a particular hate on for this particular Canadian prime minister. And that personalized element is going to, seems to me, have a tremendous impact. And this is going to be even more problematic when Mr. Trump introduces, as he has promised to do, his tariff man approach to global politics. As you know, he used tariffs, and he once proclaimed himself to be a tariff man with a capital T and a capital M. And it's likely that if Mr. Trump returns to the White House, we're going to see that particular protectionism on steroids. Mr. Trump has promised that he's going to introduce a across-the-board tariff of 10% on every single thing that comes into the United States. And there's no indication to me that we shouldn't take him extremely seriously on this. Certainly everyone who looks at the likely prospects of trade should Mr. Trump come back to the White House proclaims this to be a disaster. We also need to think about what the implications are for American foreign policy under a second Trump administration. And that's part of what Canada Alone is about. It looks at the likelihood that what we are going to see is the abandonment of Ukraine, the abandonment of NATO, and without the guardrails there within what Mr. Trump calls the deep state, I think that we are going to see Mr. Trump finally able to put his antipathy for American friends and allies into practice. He wanted very much to withdraw from NATO. He has a particular view of American friends and allies as folks who are constantly screwing the United States. His preferred verb is rape. And it seems to me that if he returns to power and he acts as everyone's retribution, then we're going to see the abandonment of Ukraine, the abandonment of NATO, and a turn to the Pacific. But here, I must admit, I'm persuaded by the perspective of some Australian strategic analysts who essentially look at the prospect of a Trump administration or an American administration devoting resources to the Western Pacific in an attempt to contain China and the existential threat that China is supposed to pose, and recognize that the costs of doing so will be so vast that what America will do is, in fact, simply withdraw from the Western Pacific. It's hard for us to conceive of this now, but in fact, if you think about what it would really cost the United States to oppose China's rise, what we're going to likely see is such costs that an America First administration, an administration that is deeply isolationist, is simply going to say that China can have the Western Pacific. If that happens, then Canada is going to be in an interesting situation. And the argument of the book is essentially that if, in fact, the United States withdraws from Europe, if it essentially withdraws from the Western Pacific, then the notion of the West that has sustained Canada's notions of engagement globally are simply going to disappear. And that without that North Atlantic context for Canadian policy across the Atlantic Ocean, and without the West in the Western Pacific, what Canada is going to be is all alone with the United States. By way of conclusion, however, let me offer perhaps a slightly more optimistic ending to what otherwise would be a dystopian vision. And that is that this outcome is, of course, hugely contingent on the behavior next fall of the 240 million Americans who are eligible to vote. And we, of course, can do nothing about that. We can do nothing about encouraging those 120 million Americans who chose not to vote in 2022 or the other millions of Americans to vote a certain way. But there is a way of reading the tea leaves and the auguries that suggests a more optimistic conclusion, that suggests that, in fact, the MAGA movement in the United States, and Mr. Trump in particular, may in fact go down to defeat. Certainly, as a Canadian, I have no difficulty in hoping against hope that by the end of 2024, my little book will be nothing more than an historical curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, as address the question to Kim. On November, well, whatever the day in November of 1980, Keith Banting and I and a few other people were watching returns come in Vancouver. I forget whether it was the ABC Faculty Club or your house, Keith, but the atmosphere was resembled that of a funeral, because everyone was convinced that the election of Ronald Reagan meant doom and gloom for Canadian interests. And in fact, there was a state of lamentation, including the memorable book by Stephen Clarkson that kind of looks like the title of your talk today, about Canada and the Reagan Challenge. And I'm wondering whether you might want to, in a comparative context, speculate on the two moods of deep pessimism, because I know you're old enough to recall the Reagan years, and not too many of us do, that characterized at least the first half of Ronald Reagan's presidency. By the second half, all of a sudden, Ronald Reagan was looking a lot better, and whether there might be some reason to assume that the contemporary doom and gloomism about Trump would possibly be modified should he get elected in a way that the doom and gloomism about Reagan obviously modified.
Absolutely, and for those of us who do remember that era, it's actually hard to describe to a contemporary audience the degree, the depth of that doom and gloom, in particular amongst sort of the Laurentian elite who had assumed that that the administration in Washington would not turn the way that the Republican administration of Ronald Reagan began, at least. As David points out, the administration as it evolved demonstrated that it wasn't going to be such a challenge. But his remembrance of the strong feeling of God, the world is ending, is quite accurate. I guess that when I look at the two periods, I actually, even though I was one of those who worried about the Reagan challenge, I guess I see a fundamental difference. Mr. Reagan had all sorts of particular idiosyncratic approaches to American politics. He, after all, and foreign policy, he, after all, ran on the slogan, "Let's make America great again." The slogan that Mr. Trump just simply plagiarized, and because people don't read enough history, simply forgot that that was also Mr. Reagan's slogan. But Mr. Reagan never campaigned on promises the way that Mr. Trump and his allies are campaigning. We now have, and there's a reason. I mean, Rob mentioned the F word, and there's a whole bunch of folks who look at American politics and, generally speaking, try hard to avoid the F word. It tended to be overused in the case of the Reagan administration. It tended definitely to be overused in the case of the George W. Bush administration. And because of that overuse, there are a number, and I count myself among them, who's really nervous about this. But I have to say that just as a number of people in the United States are drifting towards thinking that this is an appropriate word to use for the movement, the so-called Red Caesar movement, I think that we need to recognize that there are huge differences. Mr. Reagan never, for example, proclaimed that the communists and the Marxists and the far left thugs, vermin that live within our borders, need to be eliminated. The use of such language, which evokes so much of the 1930s, is something that Mr. Reagan would never, I don't think, would ever have dreamed of. Likewise, when Mr. Trump talks about immigration poisoning the blood of our nation, well, I have to say, as someone who is only here because of a particular way of conceptualizing what Deutschblutig meant in the 1930s, I have to say that this to me smacks of fascism. And when you count up all of the other things that Mr. Trump has said and is, including the notion that you know the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs should be executed for treason, the promise that a Department of Justice will go after opponents, and including those in the media, just everything about Mr. Trump's candidacy. There's a reason why Robert Kagan can write the kind of piece in the Washington Post that he did last week, and try and signal to Americans, if no one else, that they are facing a serious crisis. And for all of the sort of pants on fire concerns about Ronald Reagan, it never approached this level, I think, of danger to the American Republic. Look, the fact that the vast majority of Republican voters in the United States think that the election was stolen, that in the United States Congress, the majority of the elected Republicans believe, or say that they believe, that the election was stolen, is just simply indications that something is deeply, deeply wrong. And I guess that I remember those earlier days. I remember being freaked out by Ronald Reagan, yes, as a young kid, or a younger person. But I have to say that if you look at what's happening in the United States, and the fact that none of this is disqualifying. I mean, I don't mind saying, as a political scientist, it blows me away that tens of millions of Americans are enthusiastic about their vote in 2024 for this man and for the party that supports him.
Yeah, so thinking about your background and about American Congress in particular, I'm curious as to what your books consider the role of the other branches of the United States government being obviously. You know, President Trump theoretically would come back to make any decision for any executive branch decision he wants to, but ultimately authorization appropriation for aid packages, all the way to the Senate and Congress. So I'm just curious of maybe what you predict in 2024 with regard to the financing, you know, the Senate and the House working on that, and maybe an additional question kind of to that, because we're about Ukraine right now. Obviously, United States funding has been backed up for Ukraine and the U.S. House with a lot of mega far-right Republicans wanting stricter border control and more militarization of border occurring. So maybe two-sided question: what do you think, you know, the role is of the legislative branch of the United States in this, and what is the future moving forward?
Yeah, you want me to?
No, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think it's a really good question. I think it depends a lot on the outcome of the next election. You know, I think that one thing that as far as I understand is that it's not going to get easier for Democrats or for anyone in the U.S. who's really interested in maintaining an active role in NATO and interested in backing up Ukraine. I think because it's an especially bad Senate map. At least that's my understanding. So I think this means there are going to be some headwinds to begin with. And I think what we've already seen is some fatigue kind of setting in and how these sort of issues are debated in Congress, even under a president who still has like some vestiges of bipartisan support, still has some still putting Ukraine at the top of the foreign policy agenda. I think you could easily imagine if Trump, say, is swept into office, that this would mean members of Congress can read polls too, and you could kind of imagine that backlash sweeping through other members of Congress, especially kind of these sort of more marginal people in the, well, one, in the Republican Party who have one kind of foot in kind of the internationalist tradition and might find themselves under more market pressure. On the other hand, I think there's a bit of a movement on the far left that kind of comes around in a horseshoe fashion and also does the same thing. I guess the other thing I'd say about the way the branches interact with the story, I have to tell, is that one of the ways that I try to put the recent development I think red Caesarism is a really great term for this, in historical context, is that there's a lot of potential for that in the American system, simply because of the way that I think it's kind of built on an understanding of the president as sort of a paramount, almost kind of quasi-monarchical leader. Of course, there's potential for abuse in a parliamentary system too. There's potential for a prime minister in a Westminster system to act unchecked in a way that a president in a checks and balances presidential system actually couldn't in lots of ways. And yet I think on the level of political culture and on the level of the way the president is revered and treated as the protagonist of American politics and the protagonist of American foreign policy, let alone the tremendous legal leeway the president has to set foreign policy and to use executive orders to govern, I think that means that the U.S. system in a lot of ways is already kind of primed for this sort of Caesarism, especially if you have a political movement that is now interested in it. So I guess that's the kind of broader picture. When I see Trump as a dangerous recent development, I do think that, but also in a way that activates a lot of these dangerous anti-majoritarian latent tendencies that have been there in the constitutional order in the U.S. for quite some time.
The only thing that I would add to this is just simply taking a look at how elected members of the Republican conferences in both chambers have responded over the last couple of years. The American system is designed to work and to check executive power, but only if members of Congress take their responsibilities seriously, to use the sort of the phrase, put country over party. But what we've seen is, in fact, the domination of Mr. Trump of the Republican Congress, in particular the House of Representatives. And just simply think about all of those people who opposed Mr. Trump and where they are now. They're all out because they have been either primaried out of office or run out of office. I mean, imagine being a Republican member of Congress and having your life threatened by whom? By other Republicans. I mean, it's in that sense, it's bizarre. So that as long as we have the willingness of Republicans, both in the House and the Senate, to bend the knee to Mr. Trump, then all of those guardrails against executive power are simply not going to work. And until Americans vote against the GOP up and down the ballot, we're not going to see the disappearance of that anytime soon.
Can I jump back and make one more comment here? One thing that I don't know if anyone's familiar with the work of John Gans, but he's an American political writer who has a really interesting blog or a Substack. And one of the claims he's made is if you want to look at historical analogies for these developments in U.S. politics we just talked about, people always kind of, as I did, reach for fascist analogies. He said you could actually look at the French Third Republic as a really interesting case of a extremely polarized polity in this kind of way. And the reason I say this is a kind of interesting historical analogy is I think a lot of the polarization that we've referred to and talked about that runs through U.S. politics has to do with, I think, polarization around this kind of central issue of this, what I call the refounding period in American politics, a struggle over voting rights and civil rights and creating a really multiracial democracy. And I think part of the reason that a lot of scholars of polarization talk about polarization setting in that period of U.S. history is U.S. history, U.S. politics becomes polarized around this kind of central question. There's been an attempt to kind of refound the American polity as a multiracial democracy, yay or nay, pro or con. And when that single line runs through politics as a clear dividing line, when the question is, are you okay with this regime form or not? I think that is a recipe for a much more polarized politics. And the reason I think Gans's analogy is really interesting is that French Third Republican politics were similar in that same way. A lot of the central division was, are you okay with this regime we set up? Are you fundamentally Republican, or do you have nostalgia for the older form of government, the kind of more old regime, a monarchical form that we've replaced this, that the Republic has come to replace? So when you have a kind of central dividing line around the kind of refounding of a regime, are we okay with this or not? That is a recipe for extremely polarized politics. And I think if you look at people like Ezra Klein, who've talked about the development of polarization of politics in America since the Civil Rights Movement, the way in which the question of the U.S. as a multiracial democracy has dominated other issues, I think is behind a lot of these questions, even for something as far afield from that as might seem as, say, support for Ukraine.
Yeah, you mentioned that the possibility of a fairly visceral reaction to a Reagan win in Canada. But I just wondered what you think policy implications of that might be for Canada. Would it mean, for example, using our officials to press state governments to ensure that our economic interests are taken care of? We need to diversify trade. Obviously, that hasn't worked very well in the past with the third option. Or, invest more in our own intelligence capabilities in defense. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, in August, Mélanie Joly, our foreign minister, admitted in a French language interview in Montreal that Canada had a game plan. And the moment that the words came out of her mouth, sort of listen to them, you realize that she thinks, "Oh, I should not have said that," and for good reason too. I mean, the fact is that every state in the international system is evolving a game plan should things go a particular way in 2024. It's likely that the Canadian game plan is simply going to revisit what the Trudeau government did in 2017, because it was, at least until the summer of 2018, relatively successful. I mean, Mr. Trudeau was exceptionally and unusually disciplined in what came out of his mouth on the American administration. I mean, if you look at him as opposition leader, you can see how disciplined he became as prime minister. He did his wonderful daughter diplomacy routine that everyone thought, certainly John Higginbottom, thought was sort of so Game of Thrones. He worked a sort of whole of government approach around what was called the sort of the donut of the White House, and it worked. But as Emmanuel Macron and Shinzo Abe discovered, there really was no managing Donald Trump, and just as he turned on them, he turned on Justin Trudeau in the summer of 2018. But I think that the likelihood is, in particular, if there's going to be a retributive element to a Trumpian policy towards Canada, and I think that there would be as long as he is in power, as long as Justin Trudeau is in power. And when Mr. Poilievre's time comes, Mr. Poilievre will discover that there ain't no managing Donald Trump either, because Mr. Poilievre will, it seems to me, have no more success than any other leader in the world, given Mr. Trump's approach to the world. But beyond that, it's really difficult for any state to do anything in advance. You can prepare. You could in fact deploy a much greater diplomatic footprint in a way that we haven't in the past. I mean, my thought would be, hey, let's open consulates in state capitals, in many more state capitals than we have, in particular in blue state capitals, because red state capital relations are going to be problematic. But unfortunately for Canadians, we are in a particular moment in time when any kind of serious spending on international affairs is now so toxic politically that governments and governments to be are going to run away from the huge financial implications. And we haven't even talked about what the implications for Canadian defense policy are going to be. I mean, if there is a Trumpist administration in Washington, look for a radical change in what Joel Sikorski has so nicely called the Canadian easy rider approach to defense spending, i.e., spend as little as you possibly can get away with. Our tax bills are going to go way through the roof, and simplistic utterings of sort of axe the tax ain't going to cut it with a retributive administration in Washington.
There's a question. Please forgive me phrasing this question. I'm a little grand. The historian Timothy Snyder used a term not fascism in a series of presentations that talks he gave several years ago in describing the Trumps, the Bolsonaros, the Erdogans, the Orbans, and so on. And the reason he used that was that he felt that, forget the biological metaphor, the movements had not yet metastasized to the point of reaching the full extent of the effort. So I think bringing up Reagan is a very prescient example in this case, and to an extent, the Gandhi example as well. Reason being that Trump is to some extent a symptom of a problem more than he is an example of something bad of himself. So when you look to the Reaganism of the world, something like the Lee Atwater style strategies of Republican leadership have been in use for quite a long time in the Republican Party. As the history students and experts in the room would be aware, the party switch largely happened in the United States as a response to the civil rights movement. So given that we are aware that there are these ideological concerns that exist in American politics, and to an extent Canadian as well, and we see that the Tea Party movement from 2014 onwards is the moment at which obstructionism truly became a political tactic in the Republican Party. We're aware of the one concern, this ideological concern, of structural elements that led to the creation of the Trump movement as it exists today. To some extent, a large part of the Republican Party is either MAGA Republicans or Vichy Republicans, if you're going to point to those examples. What extent do we foresee those structural issues of money and ideology continuing to exist both in American and to some extent in Canadian politics? Because whether or not Trump ceases to be a presence individually on the political stage, those undercurrents, those structural concerns will likely remain. So do we foresee these political incentives of money and ideology that have been so drastically affecting North American politics over the last 50 years changing at any point in the near future? Or do we think that there's going to be an inevitable reckoning of something? And please forgive the dramatic line.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a really tough question. I'll have to say you kind of put your finger on one of the big things that I struggled with in getting my head around these issues and in writing this book, which I think in kind of, grand terms, you could call the struggle between structure and agency. How much of what we talk about and engage with as political thinkers is structural, and how much do individual leaders and decisions make a difference? But I also think kind of more broadly, where do you situate MAGA politics, Trumpian politics in the broader course of U.S. history? And I guess there are like two tendencies that I tried to avoid, and I tried to kind of synthesize in this book. And if you read it, you can see if you think how well I did it. But I guess one tendency is simply to say that there is nothing new to see here, nothing shocking here, because of how deeply rooted this kind of racially exclusive politics, the kind of conservative nationalism in foreign policy, the kind of isolationist view towards a lot of American allies, how deeply this goes back in American history. So there is nothing new to see here. This is fundamentally like any kind of mobilization around Trump as a unique threat is simply a way to kind of sheepdog the farther left into giving votes to Hillary or Biden, whoever ends up running in 2024. before. That's one view. The other view is the hair on fire, unique fascistic threat that has never before been seen in U.S. history. I think you can kind of caricature that as a sort of Rachel Maddow, MSNBC resistance view. And I happen to think that the truth, as far as I'm concerned, is that someone who has observed and participated in U.S. politics has got to be somewhere in the middle, has got to be some kind of synthesis between there are deep roots for this tendency, and yet there have been really interesting and scary developments in which this tendency has run up against things like demographic change in the last, not just since 2015, maybe in the last generation or so. So how do you square that circle? How do you talk about this kind of unique, the unique threat to this moment without losing sight of historical context? I guess one way I do it is by talking about these kind of deep structural issues in American politics, issues like racial polarization, issues like disputes over whether America was successfully refounded in the middle of the 20th century and how that runs as a dividing line through politics, and how it's possible for a political movement that I think is really opposed to that attempted American refounding that's centered on the civil rights movement, how it's possible for that movement to take advantage of latent anti-majoritarian features in the U.S. Constitution, and how it's possible for that movement to be deeply motivated by a fear of demographic change, and that these developments both bring together that historical structure and tell us something about what's new. I guess the other thing about how I reflect on Canadian politics, and again, if you read the book, you can judge how convincing this is. But I think that Canada went through a similar process of attempted refounding and national reckoning around a similar time the U.S. was going through. But I think that my view is that the Canadian political developments around, I think, in my book, I try to talk about this as the increasing consciousness of what it means to be a multinational country and how this developed in Canadian politics in the 20th century. I think that this attempted refounding in Canadian politics was less of a source of, doesn't mean that there is no political conflict around it, obviously, but I think it has been less consistently polarizing in Canadian politics than in US politics. So when I think about what it means to say, is it going to happen here? Can it happen here? Why not here? Part of this has to do, for me, I think, with how what we are seeing in American politics right now is a very deep challenging to the premises on which there is an attempted refounding made in the kind of middle of the 20th century, a very deep challenge to America's regime of multiracial democracy. And what I'm concerned about is whether the reaction to those developments in American politics would provoke a similar attempt to re-challenge what goes into the Canadian refounding in the same period. That happens on different political terms, happens in different contexts, deals with different issues, but nevertheless, I think has been more successful here because less polarizing. And my concern is that relatively higher degree of consensus might start coming apart in recent years. So that's how I deal with that kind of broader problem of structure and agency that you talk about, all of which is to say that this is something that I consistently grapple with when I think about these issues because of what a challenge it is to both thinking with historical context and perspective and also really doing justice to a lot of people's, I think, accurate and deep and real gut sense that this moment is uniquely perilous. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
We don't have enough time.
If you want to jump in. Yeah.
No.
The last question.
Well, I travel in the lower 48 quite often, and I find myself talking to ordinary American civilians a lot about politics because I don't know anything about sports. So my impression is extremely anecdotal. My sample size is very, very small. But I have to say that I'm astounded at how accurate David Haglund was back in the late 1980s when he described to me that the typical American is very insular and inward looking. So it's very common in my experience that the individual I'm talking with doesn't know the state in the immediate West, doesn't know their state senate, doesn't understand how their system of government works. In one of my conversations, I interviewed a teacher who said, "We don't teach civics anymore. We stopped teaching it a long time ago." And I'm wondering if how that plays into it. Ryan, I'm particularly interested in your perspective as having grown up there. And then the last thing I would ask is that, is it time for Canada to put out a welcome mat and say, "Hey man, come north, the winters are not that bad."
You want to go?
Yeah. I just very briefly, because I know we're kind of roughly out of time. when people ask me about what I appreciate about Canada having moved here, I think one of the things that I appreciate is a greater awareness of the outside world. That's not to say that they're fundamentally, that there's a fundamentally kind of more outward-looking or globalized kind of Canadian character. I think it's just part of the virtue of being a smaller country is that by the virtue of necessity, one has to be more aware of what's going on in the outside world. So I think having grown up as an American and in that period of time, I was a curious kid. I was a kid who was interested in academics. I mean, look at me now. I'm wearing a tweed jacket talking about politics at like 1 on a Thursday. But I do think that there wasn't that pressure to know that much about what was going on in Canada because it didn't affect you on a day-to-day level, which means that I think a lot of kind of mythologizing or just kind of cartoonish images fill the gap because there's not really a need for anything else. I think here the situation is a bit different, again, by kind of pressure of necessity, and that's something that I've grown to appreciate over time. Yeah, thank you.
Should Canada put up?
Oh yeah. I'm not sure what that would look like in practice, but I would say that like if there's any kind of possibility of doing a little bit to reverse the brain drain and taking advantage of I think that gives Canada a real comparative advantage. I think that there's going to be a possibility for it. Well, look, I'm living proof, right? I didn't move here because of my concern about U.S. politics, but it's certainly the fact that this looks like a more stable democracy was not a negative when I was thinking about where my family and I were going to accept the job and put down roots for our future. So there might be more people like me out there. It's possible.
Well, please join me in thanking